When George Floyd died in Minneapolis, this revived the Obama-era narrative that law enforcement is endemically racist. Barack Obama tweeted that for millions of black Americans, being treated differently by the criminal justice system on account of race was tragically, painfully, maddeningly normal. Mr. Obama called on the police and the public to create a new normal in which bigotry no longer infects our institutions and our hearts. Joe Biden released a video that same day in which he asserted that all African Americans fear for their safety from bad police, and black children must be instructed to tolerate police abuse just so they can make it home. That echoed a claim Mr. Obama made after the ambush murder of 5 Dallas officers in July 2016. During their memorial service, the president said African American parents were right to fear that their children may be killed by police officers whenever they go outside. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz denounced the stain of fundamental institutional racism on law enforcement during a Friday press conference. He claimed blacks were right to dismiss promises of police reform as empty verbiage. This charge of systemic police bias was wrong during the Obama years and remains so today. However sickening the video of George Floyd's arrest, it isn't representative of the 375 million annual contacts that police have with civilians. A solid body of evidence finds no structural bias in the criminal justice system with regard to arrests, prosecution, or sentencing. Crime and suspect behavior, not race, determined most police actions. In 2019, police officers fatally shot 1,004 people, most of whom were armed or otherwise dangerous. African Americans were about a quarter of those killed by police last year, 235, a ratio that has remained stable since 2015. That share of black victims is less than what the black crime rate would predict. Some police shootings are a function of how often police encounter armed and violent suspects. In 2018, the latest year from which such data had been published, African Americans made up 53% of known homicide offenders in the U.S. and commit about 60% of robberies, though they are 13% of the population. The police fatally shot 9 unarmed blacks and 19 unarmed whites in 2019, according to a Washington Post database, down from 38 and 32, respectively, in 2015. The Post defines unarmed broadly to include such cases as a suspect in Newark, New Jersey, who had a loaded handgun in his car during a police chase. In 2018, there were 7,407 black homicide victims. Assuming a comparable number of victims last year, those 9 unarmed black victims of police shootings represent 0.1% of all African Americans killed in 2019. By contrast, a police officer is 18.5 times more likely to be killed by a black male than an unarmed black male is to be killed by a police officer. On Memorial Day weekend in Chicago alone, 10 African Americans were killed in drive-by shootings. Such routine violence has continued. A 72-year-old Chicago man shot in the face on May 29th by a gunman who fired about a dozen shots into a residence. 2 19-year-old women on the South Side shot to death as they sat in a parked car a few hours earlier. A 16-year-old boy fatally stabbed with his own knife that same day. On a single weekend, 80 Chicagoans were shot in drive-by shootings, 21 fatally. The victims were overwhelmingly black. Police shootings are not the reason that blacks die of homicide at 8 times the rate of whites and Hispanics combined. Criminal violence is. The latest in a series of studies undercutting the claim of systemic police bias was published in August 2019 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The researchers found that the more frequently officers encountered violent suspects from any given racial group, the greater the chance that a member of that group will be fatally shot by a police officer. There is no significant evidence of anti-black disparity in the likelihood of being fatally shot by police, they concluded. A 2015 Justice Department analysis of the Philadelphia Police Department found that white police officers were less likely than black or Hispanic officers to shoot unarmed black suspects. Research by Harvard economist Roland G. Fryer, Jr. also found no evidence of racial discrimination in shootings. Any evidence to the contrary fails to take into account crime rates, and civilian behavior before and during interactions with police. The false narrative of systemic police bias resulted in targeted killings of officers during the Obama presidency. The pattern may be repeating itself. Officers are being assaulted and shot at while they try to arrest gun suspects or respond to the growing riots. Police precincts and courthouses have been destroyed with impunity, which will encourage more civilization-destroying violence. If the Ferguson effect of officers backing off law enforcement in minority neighborhoods is reborn as the Minneapolis effect, the thousands of law-abiding African Americans who depend on the police for basic safety will once again be victims. The Minneapolis officers who arrested George Floyd must be held accountable for their excessive use of force and callous indifference to his distress. And they were put in jail. Police training needs to be doubled down on de-escalation tactics, but Floyd's death should not undermine the legitimacy of American law enforcement, without which we will continue on a path towards chaos.